So my name is Morten. I'm an R&D engineer here at Anybody Technology, and I'm your host for this webcast today. Today you're going to hear an exciting topic from Professor Stephen Ferguson from Laboratory of Orthopedic Technology in ETH in Zürich, and PhD candidate Enrico De Pieri from the same lab. So Enrico and Stephen are going to talk about musculoskeletal validation and wear simulation in a project called LifeLongJoints. It's a very large EU project that has been running for several years. So this webcast is actually the second in a series, and we ran the last one in April, where some researchers from University of Leeds in England were telling about some of the data that they collected. And this webcast is in many ways a follow-up to that. And after the webcast, I'm just going to give a small talk about some of the models that were used, because some of those models have been released, and I'm going to show those models and also show you how you can use them and also run batch processing on them. So the models are very useful, both because they allow you to run this big data set, but also because they're a good example of how to do batch processing on a very large scale. And in the end, we will have a questions and answers session. So first, a quick introduction to what the Anybody modeling system is. It's a tool for musculoskeletal simulation. It takes motion data, kinematics, forces as input, and it calculates body loads, joint moments, muscle forces, and joint reaction forces, among other things. It's used in a wide variety of application, from product design, economic analysis, surgical planning, load cases for final element analysis, and also for movement analysis. And you're going to hear some of these topics here today. But with that, I'd like to give the word to Enrico De Pieri and Stephen Ferguson.
Okay, perfect. So this is Stephen Ferguson. I'll start off just with a very brief introduction to give some context to our use of the Anybody model, and then hand over to Enrico. So what we're talking about today is a model developed in the context of the LifeLongJoints project, which was already mentioned, and in a work package specifically looking at using computational methods to improve the design, validation, and even planning of treatment with total hip arthroplasty. And we consider this sort of the use of a virtual patient for future in silico predictions of implant function. And our focus in this project has been on the performance of total hip replacements. Many of you are aware, of course, of the concerns and also the benefits of total hip arthroplasty. This is an incredibly successful solution for arthritis and fractures, and generally works quite well in most patients, but there are still some considerable failure rates that have to be addressed between 3 and 10% 10 years after the implant goes in. And if you multiply this out by the number of patients who are receiving such joints, this is a pretty big economic burden. Once you have to replace one of these joints, then of course the overall success is not as good as the primary procedure. And when you consider in the graphic on the right, we see that patients are getting such implants at an earlier stage in their life and requiring therefore a longer life expectation of this implant, and also usually under more demanding conditions. The design has to continuously improve to really make these implants survive under demanding physical activities. So this is where we step in with this project. Partly because when we look at some of the clinical outcome data, so this is some data from registries, on the left is the survival rates for implants placed into younger patients, and on the right is the survival rate in older patients. We see a dramatic difference between the two. So there's something related to the way that the younger patient is using these implants, loading their joints, that is leading to a premature failure. And it seems that most of these failures beyond 3 to 5 years are due to wear or wear-related complications. So the industry's placed an emphasis on trying to understand and improve deficiencies in the implant design to combat this wear case. And this is where LifeLongJoints steps in. So the major focus of the project was the development of a new silicon nitride coating to improve the wear characteristics of the joint, and also to reduce the rate of ion release into the body to try to also limit some of the ensuing biological reactions to these joints. What came up during this whole project, though, was how can we validate the performance of such new implants and new implant coatings? And conventionally, this is done with experimental validation tests, a variety of standard defined tests to look at the wear characteristics or impingement or fatigue life of such implants, which are certainly effective. There is a lot of thought going into the specification of these standards, but such tests are, of course, very lengthy and costly and limited in the scope of loading scenarios that they can evaluate. So we asked ourselves, as many of you have also, is there a way to speed up this process, reduce the cost associated with validating new designs, and also be more thorough in our evaluation of the variety of loading conditions that these implants may be subjected to? And if we take our cue from other industries, we can also see that things like the automotive industry, they face the same problems, and they've evolved their design process over the last 4 decades. Starting in the earlier stages, you had a lot of physical prototyping and experimental testing of the performance of the car in the case of the automotive design. And this led to very lengthy development cycles and quite often not catching critical flaws that could lead to an early failure. In more recent decades, it's moved towards a highly computational dependent process where most of the early design work is done on the computer. The proof testing of individual components is done also with structural analysis. And they've even gone so far as to take a holistic view of evaluating how all the systems work together in the context of the car's performance in its environment. And of course, this is attractive. Computer simulations afford us the opportunity to, on the one hand, define better experiments. So we can test in the computer what would be challenging situations for the car. We only have to perform a few costly experiments to validate such computational models. And then we're afforded the opportunity to use computer simulations to explore thousands of different situations which are maybe not reflected in a standardized experimental test. So overall, this would reduce the time for development and the cost for development of new products. And this simulation technology has, of course, been used in the design of hip prostheses in the last few decades, but usually restricted to only the joint-specific level, looking at the performance of the implant subjected to a very narrow set of boundary conditions. And this ties in with the overall question in the orthopedic domain: is the wear of prostheses and failure of prostheses truly an implant problem? Should we be looking at just the implant's structural strength and performance, or do we have to look in a broader scope of how this works? And there's a lot of clinical studies. The one that I'll highlight is just where they identified edge loading in the hip implant in the prosthesis as one of the most important predictors of wear rate. And this already was not considered in a lot of the experimental wear testing in prostheses. So this led people to think, okay, is the prosthesis positioning also an important determinant of the overall performance down the road? So can you get edge loading or other deleterious loading conditions taking place which can affect the implant's performance? And if we think also a little bit, just a few slides back, that the young patients had a much higher failure rate than the older patients, then we start to think, okay, it's not only implant positioning, because this is probably the same between the two age groups, given the variation in surgical technique. There's probably something related to the patients themselves and how they're loading the implants that is determining the failure of these implants. There was another paper that came out just a few years ago, which included use of musculoskeletal multi-body modeling and really narrowed down the focus to, I think, a very important finding. They looked at a small subset of patients who had had a prosthesis, which had varying levels of implant wear as determined by the amount of metal ions in their blood. And these patients also had different implant placements. So some would be considered a well-placed implant, which would be shown in the blue samples in the box, which is sort of the ideal placement in terms of the inclination of the implant and the anteversion. And these show generally low wear rates or low metal ions. But there were also patients that had what would be considered a malpositioned implant, where some had a low wear rate and others had a high wear rate. So when they brought all these patients into the lab and measured their gait and then plugged the kinematics of these patients into a musculoskeletal model, they found that there is perhaps a compensatory kinematic mechanism in the patients with a low wear rate, which is helping them to prevent early failure of their implants. So it's not just the positioning of the implant, but how they actually were loading it. And that really got us down the road to what we're doing now in this project. And so that's where the antibody modeling comes in. If we consider that the wear of the implant is not only a function of time and the implant itself, but also the use, we need to know more about the internal loading of the joint and to also study the effects of surgical placement and a variety of activities that the patient might subject the joint to truly understand the potential failure mechanisms. Now, joint loading can be determined with in vivo measurements, as we find in the Autoload database, but these are usually limited to a very small population sample. They are, of course, difficult to perform, and they have certain ethical considerations. So this leads us to simulation as a more promising technique. And this actually has a nice feedback even to the mechanical or experimental proof testing of implants, because at least the outcome of a more sophisticated simulation can define better boundary conditions for such physical wear tests. And then the final thing I'd like to mention before I turn over is within our project, we also looked at the possibility of even replacing these experimental wear tests down the road in some cases to speed up progress using simulations of wear within the joint. So our collaborators at Imperial College in London and University of Leeds have also developed quite a nice joint scale wear simulation, which takes into account the elastohydrodynamic lubrication between the two components of the hip prosthesis, and also the elastic deformation of both the cup and the head materials to try to predict the interdependence of the loading of the joint, the development of a fluid film within the joint, and the corresponding wear rate locally across the implant. And what we've been able to show over the course of the LifeLongJoints project is that taking whole joint loading values, placing them onto such a wear simulation, so we see the forces that might come from a multi-body model on the top right, when these are then transferred onto the lubrication and wear model, we can get a pretty accurate prediction of the fluid film development within such a prosthesis. And as we'll see later, this also leads to a fairly decent prediction of the actual wear without ever having to physically test the implants. That, of course, still leaves open the question, is the musculoskeletal model valid? Are we getting good input data for these joint loading predictions and eventually the wear models? What can we do to refine these models? And with that, I hand over to Enrico, who will tell you about the main part of this presentation.
Thank you. So, hi everyone. Today I will first tell you about how we developed and validated our generic lower limb model, and then how we applied this model to run our population simulations. So our first objective was to somehow find or develop a reliable generic model that would allow us to predict accurately the hip concave forces. And our starting point was the TLM 2.0 musculoskeletal dataset. This cadaveric dataset is the most accurate dataset to date, and it was also implemented in a model version in anybody. However, this model has not been thoroughly tested. And although it's proven fundamental in improving the prediction at the knee level, for instance, its applications at the hip joint were not yet thoroughly tested, and we felt there were some potentially weak points that we need to further evaluate. In particular, we know that these models are quite sensitive to the accuracy in the definition of the muscle geometry, and this definition of muscle geometry can affect the contact forces prediction. In particular, for our application, the muscles that are spanned in the hip joint are quite fundamental, and we needed to further evaluate this. So with all this in mind, we wanted to document the further development of a generic lower limb model, and together with this, to propose a working logic to identify all those features in the model that may need further refinement, as well as perform an initial quantitative validation against the measured hip contact forces coming from instrumented implants. And in particular, the model validation is quite important if you want to translate any of the findings that we have from our predictions into clinical applications. And the two standards to perform this validation are normally a direct quantitative comparison with measured contact forces coming from the instrumented prosthesis, as well as an indirect comparison with EMG signals that verify the validity of the muscle recruitment algorithm that we're using in our simulations. And recently, there's been a release of synchronized motion capture and instrumented prosthesis data sample from the Autoload dataset that served us as a baseline to test the validity of our model. So we set up our model based on the geometry of the original TLM 2.0 dataset. We model our hip as a 3 degrees of freedom hip joint, a ball and socket joint, and we choose to stick to a simple muscle model for the application that we wanted to test. We then recreated the marker protocol and the laboratory setup that was provided together with this comprehensive sample from the ortholog dataset, and then scaled the model to match the anthropometry of the subject that we were analyzing. We then ran the built-in antibody routine to optimize the marker's position before performing an inverse dynamics analysis to calculate the contact forces and the muscle forces. And in order to identify those geometries, those muscle geometries that could potentially be critical, we calculated the muscle contribution of every single of these muscles to the contact forces and to the joint moments. And we had a couple of criteria in mind on what muscles could be critical. For instance, all the muscles that had a high contribution to the contact forces, but a relatively low contribution to the joint moments, probably indicated that this muscle had an inconvenient lever arm or like a wrongly modeled lever arm. Similarly, all the muscle that had a higher contribution to the joint moments, which was overall higher than the net joint moment, could also trigger the activation of the antagonist muscles and therefore lead to an overall increase on the contact forces. So we used this criteria to flag some of these muscles that were potentially critical, and then we compared these muscles to the original MRI scans from the TLM2 dataset. And whenever we found inconsistencies between the model muscle geometry and the MRI scans, we decided to modify the geometrical definition of the muscle in the model. One of these examples is the hamstrings. When we look at the contribution of the hamstrings during to the hip flexion extension moment, we see that the bicep femoris has a higher contribution than the overall net extension moment at the hip. So when we look at the geometrical definition in the model, we can see that this muscle didn't have an accurate wrapping around the condyles of the femur, and basically there was no lever arm around at the knee level. So we decided to introduce wrapping cylinder at the condyles in order to make these muscles' line of action better match the MRI scans that we had, that you can see here in blue from the TLM2 dataset. And after introducing this modification, we can notice that the overall contribution to the extension moment was reduced, as well as the overall contribution to the contact forces, which seemed to present an error originally during the swing phase. And similarly, we also modified the geometries of the gastrocnemius, all the muscle fascicles of the iliac hoops and the psoas. We also introduced individual wrapping cylinders for all the elements of the gluteus maximus, and we redistributed the origin points of the gluteus medius and minimus on the pelvis based on the originally mapped insertion areas of the TLM2 dataset. We also included via points, muscle via points to the tensor fasciae latae. And when we compare the geometrical definition before and after this refinement that we introduced, you can see here some of the differences regarding the glute muscles. In particular, what we found pretty interesting was difference that in the definition of the gluteus maximus. You can see here on the right, then after our refinement, all the elements of the gluteus maximus are better covering all the insertion area throughout the iliac crest and the sacrum. And also during a different level of hip flexion, these elements seem to have a consistently better lever arm that allows the muscle to exert a better force throughout the range of hip flexion extension. As I was mentioning before, we also needed to validate our model, and our standard for validation was the comparison with the measurements from the instrumental implant for the ortholog dataset. So we ran our reverse dynamic simulations, and we compared our predicted contact forces for the right hip with the measurements from the instrumental hips. And we found an overall a good agreement with these measurements. Overall, our root mean square error was about 0.3 times the body weight. Additionally, we also compare the predicted muscle activities with the timing of average EMG from literature. And also here we found the overall good agreement for all the muscles that we investigated, And this supports the fact that the muscle recruitment algorithm is predicting correctly the way the muscles are activated, and therefore this translates also into a better accuracy of the prediction of the contact forces as well. So overall, we found that the refinement of the muscle geometry led to an improvement of in the prediction of the hip contact forces, and we managed to reduce the root mean square error by 17%, with a maximum reduction in the error of up to 56% during the swing phase. Overall, there was a good agreement with the measurements from the instrumented implants, although some over-prediction still persists, in particular in the medial lateral direction. And we also found a good agreement with the average EMG timing from the literature. This model, of course, has some limitations, and in the development side, the TLM2 dataset is only based on a single cadaver. Additionally, we also decided to choose a simple muscle model as a base for a musculoskeletal model, and also to use a simplified knee kinematics that consisted only of a hinge joint. And with same reasonable assumption we were modeling gait. Additionally, with the major limitation in the development of this model was the fact that we didn't have access to any information about the subject-specific bone geometry, and therefore we couldn't eliminate other sources of error, as if, for instance, the pelvic width could have been a good factor that could somehow influence all the contribution of the different muscles and the different lever arms. In terms of the validation, the major limitation is the fact that we only validated our model against a single trial coming from a single subject. So we didn't test any variability in the anatomy nor in the kinematic inputs. And for this reason, any additional future release of sample data would be beneficial and would allow us to continue this validation process of the model. But to conclude, overall, we were pretty satisfied with the level of accuracy that we have achieved in our model, and this led to an improvement in the prediction of the contact forces. Regarding the validation process, we consider a validation only an initial step in a more continuous validation process. This model has to be continuously validated when applied to new studies, and this is particularly important when we want to test activities other than gait. And since we didn't have any access to such activities, we still try to run some sort of other sort of analysis to try to get an indication, try to get a feeling for potential limitations in the application of these models. And so we looked at the moment arms of all the muscle across ranges of hip flexion, hip abduction, and hip external rotation. And you can see here, for instance, for the gluteus maximus, that all the muscle elements have a pretty sufficient lever arm throughout the range of joint flexion and external rotation. For hip abduction, we see that the moment arm seems to be sufficient up to 45 degrees of abduction. And this somehow could pose a limitation in the range of applicability of our model. However, if you consider that 45 degrees of abduction is pretty high value, we still believe that this model will properly model most of the common activities of daily living. Similarly, when we look at the moment arms for the gluteus minimus and gluteus minimus, we obtain similar results. And here, the lever arms seems to be sufficient to model an even broader range of activity. And with this, basically, we consider the development of our generic musculoskeletal model established. And the next step is translating the use of this model into a modeling of a broader population of virtual patients, as Stephen was mentioning before. And it's very important that we address the variability that we have in the overall population, both in terms of anatomical and kinematics variability. And for this reason, our collaborators at the Leeds Teaching Hospitals have collected motion capture measurements from a large cohort of 137 patients performing a variety of activities of daily living. These data were presented in a previous webcast of this series that you can also find on YouTube. So we took our generic model and we scaled it to match the anthropometry of all the 137 patients. And then we run inverse dynamics analysis in an automated batch processing routine in order to calculate the contact forces for all these patients for all the activities they perform. And as Marta was mentioning before, you will hear more about this batch processing routine and how to access some of this model through GitHub later on during the webcast. So after running all the analysis of the inverse dynamics analysis for all our patients, we studied the variability of the contact forces during gait for 132 patients performing 494 gait trials of self-selected speed. And you can see here in the middle, when we look at the variability and the contact forces, despite the fact that the contact force is actually normalized by body weight, we still have quite a broad range of variability among these patients. And since we wanted to get more confidence in the validity of our models, we still perform a qualitative comparison against the data from the ortholog dataset. And we can see that the means of our prediction are pretty much within the range of variation of the ortholog dataset for all the components of the contact forces. However, our predictions span a larger overall variability. And this is probably due to the fact that we're analyzing a much larger cohort of patients. Another strength, then we decided to actually break down this variability and to look more into details into what patients' characteristics can actually cause the variability in the contact forces. And so we stratified our the contact forces and stratify our patients in terms of BMI and age, for instance, as you can see here in the two images, and we can somehow see some patterns emerging. So we perform an analysis of these differences using statistical parametric mapping, and we found significant differences in contact forces in whether we stratify our patients by BMI, age, or gait speed. And I will show more of these results at the World Congress of Biomechanics in Dublin. So if you're interested to hear more about this or you want to discuss it in person, keep an eye open for my presentation in the schedule. And another strength of the Leeds database, of all the data that were collected, is that not only we're able to analyze a routine activity such as gait, but we're also able to analyze a much broader range of activities of daily living. Some more common, such as stair climbing or bending down to put on socks, for instance, or standing up and sitting down from a chair, as well as some more complex activities, some more adverse activities daily living, such as jogging, jumping, or lunging, that you can see here on video. And for instance, these are still preliminary results, but if we look at, for instance, sitting down on a chair, also here we can see quite a large variability in terms of the contact forces that are predicted from our models. And again, if we compare these results with the variability from the ortholog dataset, we can see that the means of our prediction are again within the range of the ortholog dataset. However, these are still preliminary results, so we still need to further analyze them before gathering any conclusion. But to summarize our webcast for today, what we did was developing generic lower limb model that could be used in inverse dynamics analysis simulation to predict hip contact forces. And we applied this model to a cohort of 130 patients that differ substantially in terms of age, BMI, or fitness level, like the way they walk and how active they are. And then we also, we're currently analyzing all the activities of daily living that these patients performing are in the lab at the Leeds Teaching Hospitals. And when we put these two pieces together, so all the intrinsic variability that are coming from the patients themselves with the extrinsic variability that are coming from the activities they perform, we kind of cover the whole spectrum of loads that hip implants have to withstand during an everyday life of these patients. And our next step will be to actually include some of this input data and provide them as an input to the WEAR models that were developed at the Imperial College and the Leeds University. And by with these models, we're hoping to predict the behavior of this implant over time, and this will eventually lead us to design better implants. And with this, I would like to thank you for your attention, and I would also like to thank particularly Morten, Anna, and Casper from Anybody, and David and Tony from the Leeds Teaching Hospitals, who play a big role in obtaining all the results that I've shown you today. And with this, I can give the word back to you, Morten.
Thank you very much, Enrico. That's very nice work. I'll just see if I can make myself the presenter again. Yep. So thank you very much. So before we end, I'd like to follow up a bit on everything Enrico said. So all of the models that Enrico presented has actually been published and made available. First of all, the changes to the musculoskeletal model, those are already inside the Anybody Managed Model Repository. So those you can get access to today if you use the TLM2 model that is in the AMMR repository. The second model that Enrico showed, validating with the orthoload, I think Enrico has published that, and you will all get a link to that, I think, in the follow-up email. And then lastly, the large model that modeled all those 133 patients, that model we are also publishing today. So that has been available, made available on GitHub. So you can find it by going to github/anybody/Leeds LifeLongJoints model. And from there, you can either clone it or you can download it directly. So if you do that, that's basically just clicking the green download button. You will get a folder, as you see on the right side. And I'll quickly walk you through how to use this kind of model and also how to do batch processing for those of you who are interested in these kind of things. But before we continue, I would like to encourage people who have to ask, would like to ask questions to answer them now before we get to the questions and answer session. Yes, I think I'll just mute you, Enrico, until we get you back again. So, yeah. But firstly, keep in mind that when you download the model from GitHub, it contains no patient data. You have to obtain the data yourself directly from Leeds University, and they are releasing the data as time goes by in batches, I think. You can also request to get access to it. But when you download data from the Leeds repository with all the C3D files, you have to place those C3D files in the C3D files folder in order for you to run all those models. So let's take a closer look at the actual model. Inside, you will find a folder called subjects that contains all the subjects, all those 140 or 130 subjects. If you open up one of those subject folders, you will again see a lot of subfolders, and there is a subfolder for every trial. So the different trials means different things. FAST is fast walking, STS is sit to stand, FOB is foot on bench. So different kinds of activities of daily living. And if you open up one of those, folders, you will again find a main file. So there are a main file, or like a main anybody file for every one of those activities. So if you want to run a specific trial, you find the main file for that specific trial. There's also some specific trials that you need to run first in order to work with this, and these are the standing reference trials. They are marked with the name static in the name of the trial. So those need to be run first because those are the trials that scale the model and find the optimal marker precisions. So let's just take a closer look at how you actually do that. So if you open up one of those static trials, as we've done here, this is the view that you would get in Anybody. And what you can see from the model perspective is that the markers are not really sitting in the wrong place, and the model is not scaled. So in order to scale the model and run, we need to run a certain study that is called parameter identification. And that will run an optimization that scales the model and fits the markers. And after doing that, you can see the marker sits in the right position and the model is scaled. So you can imagine that you must run this for all the trials. And there are sometimes multiple static trials or standing reference trials for each subject. So in total, I think there were 237 trials. So it's not really a manual task to run all of these in the GUI application. But luckily, we have a solution for that. Anybody comes with a console version, which is basically anybody without the graphical user interface. And you can find this together with the anybody exe file. There's this file called anybody.conf.exe. And if you launch that, you can execute textual commands to make the model do stuff. And these are the AnyScript macros. And AnyScript macros are basically things that allow you to do the same thing as you could do in the graphical user interface. Things like loading a model, running a model, or selecting operations, or executing class operations. You can also run commands to export data. But running these commands is not always as easy. You might have to put the commands in a file and then execute those files. So we have some tools to make all of this batch processing a little bit easier. And one of these tools is a software system or a software library in Python that has been developed at Aalborg University. And this makes batch processing a whole much easier. So a quick example of this, if you have this Python library installed, all you really need to do is run batch processing is first to import some classes from the library to do processing and generate the macros. Next, you instantiate one of those AnyPyProcess objects while specifying how many processes you want to be able to run in parallel. So you can use this tool to really speed up batch processing by running multiple simulations in parallel. Next, you specify a list of macro operations that you want to run. In this case, it's simple. We basically want to load the main file and we want to run this parameter identification study. But it could be much more complicated, like setting variables or exporting certain data. And then finally, on this app object, we basically run this start macro method by providing as argument the macro we want to run, and then an argument for where it should run it. So in this case, it will search all the subdirectories for files that has the name static in them and ends with main.any. So this command here will basically execute all those static trials. And when you do that, you will sort of get a progress bar that says how far are you gone in your batch processing. This was just a quick introduction. You can find a complete example of how to do batch processing on this Leeds LifeLongJoints model. That is on GitHub. That shows you both how to run the standing reference trials and also run all the dynamic trials. But you need to keep in mind that you actually need the data to run this. And some data has already been released from Leeds and you can just download. And I think the whole data set will be released over time unless you just ask the researchers there if you can get access to it earlier. There's also some documentation on this AnyPyTools library where you can see get more information of how to use it. For example, how to run more complex studies, Monte Carlo studies, and different kinds of optimizations. Finally, I would like to say that we just today released a new version of the Anybody modeling system. It's a fairly small release, but I thought I would mention it anyway since it came out today. So it's a minor release, smaller changes and bug fixes. But one new thing which I like to mention is that now the model repository all comes with a DOI, so like a stamp. And you can use these DOIs when referencing which model repository you're using. It also means that all the model repositories are now also archived on Zenodo, which is an open science platform hosted at CERN. So from there you can go in and even download the MMR, but you can also see how to reference it correctly. If you open up Anybody, install the new version, open up Anybody and click this help and then AMMR documentation, you can find the changelog for what's new in the AMMR. And if you click release notes, you can find the changelog for what's new and changed in the Anybody modeling system. So check that out and see if there's any issues that relates to your model. Then finally, we come to the end. You can find more webcasts on our YouTube channel. So go to youtube.com/anybodytech. You can also find more event dates and a publication list on our website. And And I really recommend the publication list that we have in there. It makes it easy to find people who have done anybody simulations, which is similar to the area of interest that you work on. And then I will encourage you all to also meet us at World Congress of Biomechanics. So we are attending that, similar to what Enrico and Stephen were. And yeah, maybe finally I should say that we are still hiring people. We are looking for a biomechanics specialist and maybe a simulation core developer. So those positions are still open, and you can find them on our website. We plan to, of course, to make the whole presentation here available on YouTube. So you will get a follow-up email within a week or so. And also the follow-up email will include, I believe, a PDF version of the slides. So so people will be able to see the slides again. So but I think we should end here now, Enrico. Thank you very much for the nice presentation, and thank you very much to you, Stephen, as well.
Pleasure.
Yeah. So so with that in mind, I will say goodbye to everyone who attended here. I hope everyone, you have a nice summer. I think the next webcast from us will probably be somewhere after the summer, but this has not been planned yet. So with that, see you later, everyone, and thanks a lot for attending.